All right. Chapter 35, The Greatness of Forgiving. About 2.5 years into my stay in Rishikesh, I got a fax from Manny, my biological father. This is the one that had abused her in her childhood. We'd been out of touch for many years. I'd seen him only once since I was 7. I referred to him as the quote-unquote sperm donor to distinguish him from Frank, my true dad, who raised me, taught me, guided me, and loved me. I hated Manny. He had given me more than his genes. In September 1979, when I was 8, I was preparing to visit him in Colorado, where he'd moved after divorcing my mother. He called her to cancel. He had cancelled my last several scheduled visits, I'm putting the emphasis on the wrong words. My last several scheduled visits as well, for one reason or another. This time my mother said, "I cannot do this to her again. If you want to cancel, you tell her." As I sat on the edge of my parents' bed, the man who had gifted me his DNA told me that he did not want to see me again. He went on to explain that I wasn't really his daughter, that the biological connection did not inherently create an emotional one. The science of attachment is fascinating. I had no positive memories of any time spent with him since he had pulled out of the driveway when I was 3. Weekend visits while he still lived in Los Angeles included emotional and sexual abuse and pathological behavior that I interpreted as just his personality. But my psychological attachment was stronger than reason, and I was distraught. How could he not want to see his own daughter? How could he not want to see me? For a full decade after that phone call, I wrote him poignant letter after poignant letter, begging to know why he wouldn't see me. What had I done? I sent him photographs of me as I grew. There was never any response. The first communication I received after that September phone call as I entered 3rd grade was at the beginning of my freshman year at Stanford in 1989, a full decade later. The divorce agreement with my mother compelled him to cover a portion of my college education, and Stanford had a policy whereby it would accept tuition payments only from students directly, not from their parents or guardians. Therefore, he needed to communicate. His letter mentioned wanting to reconnect. It was neither apologetic nor tender, but it was an opportunity for which I'd been yearning for 10 years, so I responded, albeit trepidatiously. I visited him once in Denver during spring break during my first year at Stanford. He opened the conversation, the first one we'd had in a decade, by explaining that if I was looking for apologies, if I was looking for repentance, I was looking in the wrong place. He continued by telling me that having me was the second biggest mistake of his life. Marrying my mother was the first. The rest of the evening is a blur. It faded quickly into the comfort of dissociation, that special place where I could be in the world but not of it, physically present but untouchable. Dissociation had been my friend for years, ready to rescue me from any painful situation and take me into the playground of my mind where I could run freely in the grass. I was in the first of 3 hospitals less than a week later, a few days after arriving back at my college dorm. I vomited so much blood that the doctors thought I might have ruptured my esophagus. You cannot vomit up your father. You cannot feed on his love. Neither is he present in what you take in, nor is he present in what you force out. I knew the truth of what I was doing. I knew how to talk to myself and others about it, and I knew the absurdity of it, but I couldn't stop. Our only communication during the next year, which I spent in and out of hospitals and eating disorder units, was through doctors and lawyers. His legal obligation to pay for my college had one stipulation. I had to stay continuously enrolled full-time. This clause was to protect him from having to pay for a degree in which I took only 1 or 2 classes at a time and ran up bills year after year. It was not intended to absolve him in case of a medical leave of absence. However, after my first semester spent in a hospital rather than in class, he sent my mother a letter saying he would no longer pay since I had violated the terms of the agreement. They finally agreed on a settlement in which he gave a lump sum payment and would be responsible for nothing else again, ever. At 19 years of age, I signed papers legally absolving him of any further paternal responsibility. A month later, Frank legally adopted me. Then, suddenly, 8 years later, after I'd moved to India, this fax arrived. My family doctor had contacted him for medical history details. In his reply, he requested my contact information. So I gave the doctor permission to provide him my fax number in Rishikesh. Manny's letter was sweet, kind, caring, and interested in my life in India. It did not include apologies or repentance. He had long since told me I would never get that. It seemed, however, genuinely nice. Hesitantly, I wrote back. I was not willing to turn my back on this opportunity for a relationship with a man I knew only through the ways he had hurt me, but whose presence and acceptance had felt so vital throughout my childhood. We exchanged a few faxes. I shared details of my life in India, the schools we were building, the medical camps, and the women's vocational training centers. I said nothing about my spiritual experiences or the depth of openings and awakenings. I said nothing about the ceremony I had done to forgive him and give my pain to Ganga. His letters were filled with questions, wanting even more details about my life in India and appreciation for the good work being done. They were superficial, but perfectly normal and innocuous. Lakonen had asked if this book is based on the author's diary or something. This is something wonderful about the spiritual path, is that your memories of childhood and decades ago just open up so easily. If you read from almost any spiritual teacher's autobiography, you'll find details stretching back all the way to the first few years in such impeccable detail. I first was thinking about that when I was listening to the autobiography of a yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda, that he would talk in such detail about conversations he had when he was 5 years old or less than that. And I'd think, my goodness, was he keeping a diary since then with every detail of his life? But once I got to a later part of the book, no, he said, I go into meditation and I revisit those times as they were. My conversations with my guru, with my parents, with my sister. I would go back in time and appear before the scenario and then write down what I saw again. I think that's just wonderful. It goes to show that there's just so much experience within us, but due to repression and trauma, perhaps preventing us from going back that far. And due to the turbulence of our mind, it's very difficult for us ordinary folks to do that until we have proper training. All right. The sweetness of his letters unraveled me. Who is this man? I had such a complete picture of him as a terrifying, haunting monster. Now, more than 2 decades after violating the very body he'd given me, after attempting to rub out, to smear away, to extinguish the very life he'd created, after turning the tools of his profession, of medicine, of psychiatry, into tools of torment, now he wanted to be friends. There would be, it was clear, no discussion of anything that had happened in the last nearly 30 years, not the abuse, not the abandonment, nor any ramifications of it. Now we would just chat lightly about academic curricula in India compared to America, about whether sewing or embroidery was more of a useful skill for women in the Himalayas. My head spun. I looked deeply into each mirror I passed. Who am I? What really happened? Is this the man of my nightmares? Are these letters from the monster? Could a man capable of what he'd done just turn around and become normal? Had he ever been anything other than normal? Had I made it all up? Were my memories figments of my imagination, projections of my doctors and psychologists? The foundations on which I understood my life was coming apart. I finally reached out to Swamiji, my guru. I need to ask you something important. I have never asked you to use your magic powers, but I need you to use them now. He smiled at me. Bolo. Speak. I took a deep breath and tried to keep my anxiety under control. I have, as you know, vivid memories of horrendous abuse at the hands of my biological father. I have spent decades of my life suffering and healing from the abuse and all the effects it has had on my life. Now, this man is sending me faxes that are so nice, so sweet, that they don't seem like they could have been written by a man capable of inflicting the pain of my memories. I need you to use your magic and tell me whether the abuse I remember really happened. Was it fact, or did I make it up? Swamiji was silent, but kept staring at me. Please tell me, I begged. My guru rose from his chair and began to organize files on his table. They were already in immaculate order. Files dedicated to cleaning of Ganga in one group, others on new technologies for river rejuvenation, meetings with government officials, papers to be followed up on, options for solid waste management with the pros and cons for each for rural India. As he stood, he straightened the piles, already far neater than anything on my desk had ever been. He moved his pen from one edge of the table to the other, threw away a scrap of paper on which there was no more room to write notes. We had already had a prior conversation about the use of what is known as the siddhis, magical powers. These abilities are those that come through deep and intense spiritual practice, sustained over many years and typically under the direction and grace of an enlightened master. Some may have siddhis from early childhood or even birth, marks of a soul that has done great sadhana, spiritual practice, or in a past life and took another birth just to finish up some specific karma. Or in the case of the saints and enlightened beings, there are those who come back after death and, out of compassion and grace, take a physical form to help others. Siddhis are also gained through continuous recitation of certain mantras, along with esoteric yogic practices. These powers are, however, seen as distractions from the path, byproducts of intense sadhana, a temptation along the way, not the goal. There are, in fact, many stories of religious figures who, distracted by the siddhis, ended up going astray and losing their way. So, while some may use them consciously and judiciously in order to increase faith in followers or convince a hardened scientific mind of the miracles of spirituality, typically masters avoid using the siddhis they have or even speaking about them. In the first few months at my time at Paramarth, where I originally began helping Swamiji with correspondence, we would go through letter after letter quickly. I took notes in my own scribbled versions of shorthand. One day, toward the end of 1996, he received a letter from a young girl in Fiji filled with questions. She was paralyzed by anxiety, and her letter was a plea for help. I went through the questions one by one, reading them aloud to Swamiji and noting his answers. "I worry about falling sick," she wrote. "Take care of your health, serve others with dedication, and have faith in God," he responded. "Should I focus on my studies or try to find a husband?" "Study, my dear. You are still young. Enrich your mind so you may better serve the world. You will find a good husband in due course." "I find myself panicked with fear about whether my parents will die in an accident or by natural death." "Natural death." The pen dropped from my hands, and I froze. I raised my eyes to him. "Swamiji, this girl may be only a teenager now, but she trusts you so fully. If, even 40 years from now, her parents die in an accident, she will remember what you told her, and she will lose her faith. Are you sure you want me to write this?" "Natural death. Move on. Next question." I couldn't move or lower my eyes from his face. "Do you know this, Swamiji?" I whispered. "Next question. Move on." It was the first time I had ever seen him uncomfortable, not at full ease with the present moment and situation. He clearly did not want me to keep questioning him on how he knew or what he knew, but I couldn't stop myself. "Swamiji, please tell me, do you really know this?" He stood up. "We'll finish the letters tomorrow. Go now." That was my introduction to the concept of a siddhi, explained to me later by one of the elder devotees, a woman from Jaipur. "He knows everything," she said. "However, he does not use these powers. He wants to keep us focused not on his miracles, but on the miracles of the divine, focused not on him as the doer, but on God." I said nothing more about the questions of the girl from Fiji, and simply mailed his letter to her as instructed. I did not mention the powers again until this day, a few years later, when I could not help myself. "You must tell me," I pleaded desperately. "It is really important for me to know if this all happened or if I just made it up in my imagination." Finally, amid arranging papers on his table, without looking up, he said, "You have forgiven him. That is your greatness." Swamiji turned and walked into the other room. I followed in a close pursuit, blinded by everything other than my need to know. "But did it happen, Swamiji? Did it actually happen? Are my memories correct?" He ignored me and repeated, You have forgiven him. That is your greatness. Swamiji, please, I begged. I was stuck. I was not interested in the subtleties of different levels of existence. I was not interested in the truth of our oneness and the illusion of separation between people. I was not interested in anything other than knowing on this very physical, real plane of existence. Had it happened or had it not? Relentlessly, I followed my guru from room to room as he moved about, picking up a file here, folding a shawl there, anything to avoid my pursuit. Finally, after the 4th or 5th time I asked the same question, but did it really happen? In an increasingly obsessed frenzy, Swamiji turned around in a moment of great compassion, mixed, I am sure, with great exasperation, met my eyes, and through my eyes bore into the deepest corners of my being. Matter-of-factly, he said, "To forgive something that did not happen is not so great." So that was it. The full lesson in 2 short sentences. It had happened, but that was not the important part. My lesson was not about what he had done, but about my own forgiveness. My lesson was rooted in forgiveness and greatness. I was not a victim. I was someone who had, given the opportunity, expanded enough to forgive. He neither condemned nor condoned my father's acts. He offered no sympathy, no process, no lap in which to cry or work out the turmoil of my mind. Nothing was relevant save my forgiveness and the way that seed of forgiveness was blossoming into a tree of greatness. The greatness of which he spoke was not a greatness of separate achievement. It was simply an opening, an expansion into a place where 2 became 1, where the strong lines in between him and me, between perpetrator and victim, between doer and doee, between subject and object dissolved, and I was able, most of the time, to live free in each present moment, not as the victim of my rehearsed history. The teaching regarding forgiveness is complex and fraught with many yes, but. Yes, of course we should forgive as spiritual, compassionate beings, but doesn't that make us weak? How many times should we just keep forgiving while the world or specific individuals trample over us time and again? If we forgive, who will right the wrongs being done to us? We forgive because we need to be free. We forgive to expand the space and consciousness within ourselves. Holding on to pain, holding on to grudges constricts us. It defines who we are by thick lines. I am the one who was abused. I am the one who was wronged. I am the one who always gets the short end of the stick. I am the alcoholic, or I am the child of the alcoholic. The greatness of which Pujya Swamiji spoke was not an ego-defining greatness of me as a separate great being. It was an acknowledgement of what is able to flow through me when I surrender my attachment to the story, when I loosen the grip on my identity as the victim, into the space created by surrender, into the space created by awareness of the perfection of the universe. Grace and greatness flows. Thank you for listening. Now I understand why the universe had ensured such an exclusive audience for this precious reading. Concept of siddhis. something only discussed in very specific circumstances. And the trauma that our author has gone through is triggering to many. I am sure that exactly those who needed to hear this chapter did tonight as we read, and no more. We'll pause our reading there for now and continue next time as we journey from Hollywood to the Himalayas. Namaste.